A destitute maid offers her last piece of bread to a stranger, unaware he is the reclusive billionaire who will soon hire her. You are not welcome here. Leave at once. The rain hammered down on the grimy windowpane like 1,000 desperate fists, a relentless and wild assault against the fragile glass. Ilara watched the rivulets of water trace jagged paths through the dirt, each one a tiny, weeping river mirroring the unspoken sorrow that had settled deep within her bones, a cold and permanent resident in the hollow chambers of her heart. She flinched. The words, sharp and sterile as shards of ice, had been delivered by a woman whose face was a mask of disdain, and they echoed in the cavernous, empty space of the employment agency's waiting room. The finality of the rejection was a physical blow, a sudden tightening in her chest that made the already thin air impossible to breathe. She clutched the worn strap of her handbag, the cracked pleather a familiar, flimsy anchor in a world that was determined to let her drift away into nothingness. Her knuckles were white, a stark contrast to the pale, almost translucent skin of her hands. A quiet, dignified nod was all she could manage, a silent acknowledgement of her defeat before she turned and walked away from the polished mahogany desk, her footsteps making no sound on the plush, unforgiving carpet. She was a ghost already. Outside, the city wept with her. The biting cold of the autumn wind sliced through her threadbare coat, a garment so thin it offered more memory of warmth than actual protection. The wind carried with it the scent of wet asphalt and decay, the perfume of a city that had no time for the gentle or the weak. Ilara pulled the collar tighter around her neck, a futile gesture against the invasive chill that seemed to seep directly into her soul. Every sharp gust felt like a personal judgment, every indifferent face that passed her on the sidewalk a confirmation of her invisibility. She walked with her head down, her eyes fixed on the fractured pavement, a mosaic of gray and black that reflected the shattered state of her hopes. Each crack was a path not taken, each puddle a murky portal into a future she could no longer imagine with any clarity. The city's symphony was a cacophony of blaring horns and distant sirens, a soundtrack for her quiet desperation. Her stomach clenched with a familiar, gnawing ache. It had been 2 days since her last proper meal, a bowl of thin soup she had shared with her son, Leo, making sure he took the lion's share of the broth and the few vegetables that floated within it. The hunger was a constant, dull throb, but it was nothing compared to the seismic terror that gripped her when she thought of Leo. His cough had worsened in the last week, a dry, rattling sound that splintered the quiet of their tiny apartment at night. The doctor's words were a relentless echo in her mind: medicine, warmth, proper nutrition. 3 simple things that felt as unattainable as distant stars. She had failed again. Her apartment was on the 5th floor of a crumbling tenement building, a place where the walls breathed dampness and the scent of mildew was a permanent fixture. The journey up the stairs was a pilgrimage of exhaustion, each step a monumental effort for her weary body. The air grew colder and thinner as she ascended, the stairwell lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast long, dancing shadows on the peeling paint. It was a place of transience, a home for those who were just passing through on their way to somewhere better or somewhere worse. Ilara's key trembled in her hand as she fumbled with the lock, the metal cold against her skin. The soft click of the door opening was the only sound that greeted her. Inside, the silence was heavy, thick with the unspoken anxieties that permeated the very fabric of the room. Leo was asleep on the lumpy sofa, a thin, worn blanket pulled up to his chin. His small face, even in slumber, was pale and etched with a fragility that made Ilara's heart ache with a fierce, protective love. He was the only beautiful thing left in her world, the single point of light in an encroaching darkness. A soft, wheezing sound escaped his lips with every breath. She needed that medicine. She knelt beside him, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to wake him. She gently brushed a strand of damp hair from his forehead. His skin was too warm, a feverish heat that sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She looked around the small, sparse room. It was clean, meticulously so, but it was undeniably a space defined by poverty. A small table with 2 mismatched chairs stood in one corner, a hot plate with a single, dented pot in another. There was no television, no radio, only a small stack of books borrowed from the library. On the wall above the sofa hung a single, framed photograph, a smiling man with kind eyes, his arm wrapped around a younger, radiant Alara. Her husband, David. Gone 2 years now, taken by a sudden illness that had devoured their savings and then his life, leaving her adrift in a sea of grief and debt. She reached up and touched the cool glass of the frame, her fingers tracing the outline of his face. His smile had once been her anchor, the steady, unwavering light that guided her. Now, it was a painful reminder of everything she had lost. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a cold path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. She could not afford to cry. Crying wouldn't pay the rent, which was 3 weeks overdue. Crying wouldn't buy the small bottle of liquid that could soothe the fire in her son's lungs. There was one last chance, a final, desperate hope she had been clinging to. An interview for a cleaning position at the Blackwood Manor, a place spoken of in hushed, reverent tones throughout the city. It was the home of Alistair Blackwood, a man as mysterious and reclusive as his mansion was grand and forbidding. The interview was in an hour. It was a long walk, and the storm was growing worse, but it was the only option she had left. She looked at the eviction notice peeking out from under a stack of unpaid bills on the table. Its red letters screamed at her. She had to go. She tucked the worn blanket more securely around Leo, her touch as gentle as a prayer. She scribbled a quick note, telling him she'd be back soon and that she loved him, and placed it on the pillow beside his head. Then, she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped back out into the storm. She was not defeated yet. The walk to Blackwood Manor was a battle against the elements. The wind howled through the canyons of the city, tearing at her clothes and pushing her back with an invisible, malevolent force. The rain had transformed from a steady downpour into a torrential onslaught, soaking her thin coat through in a matter of minutes. Each drop was icy, and soon a deep, unshakable shiver took root in her body. She clutched a small, foil-wrapped parcel in her pocket. It was her food for the day, a single, slightly stale piece of bread she had saved from the day before. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. The thought of it was a small comfort, a promise of sustenance later, after the interview, after she had secured the job that would save them. Hope, as fragile as it was, propelled her forward. The grand, wrought iron gates of the estate finally came into view, their ornate spires like skeletal fingers reaching for the bruised, purple sky. The manor itself was set far back from the road, a dark, Gothic silhouette against the churning clouds. It looked less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a place where joy had long since been laid to rest. As she approached the gates, she saw a figure huddled under the meager shelter of a stone archway just outside the entrance. It was a man, his shoulders slumped in a posture of profound defeat. He was dressed in simple, dark clothes that were soaked through, clinging to his frame. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he stared out into the rain with eyes that seemed utterly vacant, hollowed out by a grief she recognized instantly. It was the same haunted look she saw in her own reflection sometimes. He looked lost, not just in the storm, but in the world itself. Her first instinct was to hurry past. She was already late, and her own situation was precarious. A moment of internal hesitation, a battle between her desperation and her compassion. The man didn't look dangerous, just shattered. She saw the way his hands were trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, some internal tremor of the soul. She thought of David, of the helplessness she had felt watching him fade away. She thought of Leo, so small and vulnerable. Her own suffering had not hardened her heart, it had softened it, made it more attuned to the quiet pain of others. Her inherent goodness, the unwavering moral compass that had guided her through every hardship, won out. She stopped. He didn't seem to notice her at first, so lost was he in his own private tempest. She cleared her throat softly. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the wind. The man startled, his head snapping up. His eyes, when they met hers, were a startlingly deep shade of gray, like the storm clouds above. They were filled with a raw, unspoken agony that made her breath catch in her throat. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two strangers connected by the universal language of sorrow. "You're soaked," she stated simply, the words inadequate for the scene before them. She fumbled in her pocket, her cold fingers clumsy, and pulled out the small parcel of bread. She held it out to him. "It's not much, but you look like you need it more than I do." He stared at the foil-wrapped bread as if it were a foreign object, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared. Elara then remembered the old, rickety umbrella tucked into her bag. It had a few broken ribs and a patch on the canopy, but it was better than nothing. She opened it with a rusty groan and held it out to him as well. "Here," she said, her voice gentle. "Take this. It will offer some protection." The man, Alistair Blackwood, though she did not know it, was frozen. He had come here, to the gates of his own home, after visiting the one place he had avoided for 5 long years, the small, private cemetery on the edge of his property where his wife, Isabel, and his daughter, Lily, were buried. The anniversary of their death had driven him out of the suffocating silence of his mansion and into the storm, as if the physical tempest could somehow mirror the one raging inside him. He had stood before their graves, a ghost in his own life, feeling nothing but a vast, icy emptiness. The world had become a transactional, cynical place since they had left it. Kindness was a currency he no longer believed in. And then, this woman appeared. A fragile-looking creature, battered by the same storm he was, with haunted eyes that held a quiet, dignified strength. She was offering him her last piece of food. She was offering him her only shelter. She expected nothing in return. It was an act of such pure, selfless kindness that it shattered the thick wall of ice that had encased his heart for years. It was a single, brilliant flash of light in his endless, gray world. A profound, life-altering impact. He finally found his voice, though it came out as a rough, cracked whisper. "Why?" She offered a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Because no one should have to face a storm alone." She pushed the bread and the umbrella into his hands, her cold fingers brushing against his for a fleeting second. The brief contact sent a strange warmth through him, a jolt of feeling in a body that had been numb for so long. "I have to go," she said, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. "I have an interview," and with that, she turned and hurried through the gates, leaving him standing there, stunned into silence. He watched her go, a small, solitary figure swallowed by the rain and the grandeur of his estate. He looked down at the objects in his hands. A worn, patched umbrella. A humble piece of bread. They felt like sacred artifacts. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. Elara arrived at the imposing front door of Blackwood Manor, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her face, her clothes dripping water onto the pristine marble steps. She looked like a drowned rat, a far cry from the professional appearance she had hoped to present. She raised a trembling hand and knocked on the heavy oak door. It swung open almost immediately, revealing a stern-faced woman in a crisp, black uniform. This was Mrs. Gable, the head housekeeper, a woman whose face seemed permanently set in a scowl of disapproval. Her eyes swept over Elara's drenched form, and her lips curled into a sneer. "You're late," she snapped, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "And look at the state of you. You're tracking water all over the entryway." Elara winced, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, trying to shrink into herself. "The storm. I was delayed." Mrs. Gable was unmoved. "Excuses are the currency of the incompetent. Beatrice Blackwood demands punctuality and perfection. You have demonstrated neither." She made no move to let Elara inside. "The position is filled. We have no need for you." The words were a death knell to her flickering hope. It was the same rejection, just delivered with more cruelty this time. "Please," Elara whispered, the single word a desperate plea. "I need this job. I'll work harder than anyone, the housekeeper let out a short, derisive laugh. I'm sure you will. Now, leave the premises before I have security escort you out. She began to close the door. Elara saw the opulent interior for a brief second, gleaming floors, a cavernous hall, a grand staircase, a world of wealth and comfort that was utterly alien to her. Then the heavy door clicked shut, the sound echoing with a brutal finality. She was gone. The walk home was a blur of misery. The rain had not lessened, and now the cold had seeped deep into her marrow, a bone-deep chill that no amount of shivering could dislodge. Defeat was a heavy cloak, far heavier than her waterlogged coat. Each step was a monumental effort, her body and spirit both broken. When she finally reached her building, she found a new notice taped to her apartment door. This one wasn't a warning. It was a formal eviction notice, its bold, black letters spelling out her doom. She had 48 hours to vacate the premises. The piece of paper trembled in her hand. She had failed. Utterly and completely. She let herself into the apartment, the silence inside even more oppressive than before. Leo was still asleep, his breathing still shallow and ragged. She had nothing. No job, no money, and soon, no home. She sank to the floor, her back against the cold door, and for the first time in a very long time, she allowed the tears to come. A sob caught in her throat, a raw, ragged sound of pure despair. It was a quiet, desperate weeping, the sound of a spirit finally splintering under an unbearable weight. She had been so strong for so long, but now, in the face of this final, crushing blow, her quiet resolve crumbled into dust. She was alone, and she was terrified. There were no miracles in her world. Total silence. Meanwhile, Alistair stood unmoving in the rain, the worn umbrella held above his head. The bread was still clutched in his other hand. The woman had vanished, but her presence lingered, a warm ember in the cold furnace of his chest. He finally turned and walked through the gates, his steps more purposeful than they had been in years. The encounter had shaken him from his stupor, a sudden, sharp awakening from a long and desolate dream. He entered his own home through a side door, bypassing the main entrance. The mansion was silent, a sterile tomb filled with expensive furniture and hollow echoes. He found Mrs. Gable in the main hall, her face a mask of smug satisfaction. "I dismissed the applicant, Mr. Blackwood," she announced, clearly proud of herself. She was late and presented herself in a most unsuitable fashion. Utterly drenched. "Your mother, Beatrice, gave strict instructions." Alistair's gaze sharpened, a flicker of cold fire in his grey eyes. "A woman, with dark hair, in a thin coat?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Mrs. Gable nodded. "Yes, that's the one." A rather pathetic creature, a muscle clenched in Alistair's jaw. It was her. The woman who had shown him a kindness he thought no longer existed. His mother's petty cruelty, enacted through her loyal servant, had turned away the one person who had managed to reach him. A quiet, simmering rage began to build within him. "You are dismissed, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Pack your things. I want you out of this house within the hour." The housekeeper's jaw dropped. "But, sir. Your mother." "My mother does not run this house." "I do," he cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now get out." He strode past her, leaving her sputtering in his wake. He went to his study, a cavernous room lined with books he never read and dominated by a large, polished desk. For the first time in 5 years, he felt a sense of purpose. He had to find her. He made a single phone call to his head of security, a man who was fiercely loyal to him, not his mother. "I need you to find someone," Alistair said, his voice crisp and commanding. "A woman who applied for a cleaning position here today. Her name is Elara. Find out everything about her. Where she lives, her circumstances, everything. I want the information on my desk by morning. It is of the utmost importance." He hung up the phone and sat back in his leather chair, the worn umbrella resting on the corner of his desk like a trophy. He slowly unwrapped the small parcel she had given him. The bread was simple, humble. He broke off a small piece and ate it. It tasted of rain and kindness, the most profound meal he had eaten in years. A renewed purpose began to solidify within him. He had spent years wallowing in his grief, a passive observer of his own life. This woman, this Alara, had inadvertently handed him a reason to act. He would not let her kindness be her undoing. He would find her, and he would repay her selfless act, not with a simple transaction, but with a salvation she could never imagine. His grief had not vanished, but it was no longer the only thing inside him. Now, there was awe. There was intrigue. And there was a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't felt since he was a husband and a father. The quiet observation had begun. By morning, a sleek, confidential file lay on his desk. It contained everything. Ilara's address, her late husband's medical bills, her mounting debt, the eviction notice. And a small, heartbreaking section on her son, Leo, and his chronic respiratory illness. The sterile, typewritten words painted a portrait of a life of quiet, dignified desperation. Alastair read every word, and with each sentence, the protective fire within him grew hotter. He saw the cold, hard facts of her suffering, and he contrasted them with the memory of her gentle face, offering him her last meal in the pouring rain. The injustice of it all was a bitter taste in his mouth. He picked up the phone again and began to issue a series of quiet, precise commands. His voice was calm, but the effects of his words would be seismic for Ilara. First, he called his personal attorney. There is an apartment, number 5B at 142, Elm Street. The tenant is Ilara Vance. I want you to buy the entire building. Immediately. The eviction notice on her door is to be considered null and void. She is to live there, rent-free, for as long as she desires. And she is never to know who is responsible. Handle it. Next, he contacted the director of the city's top pediatric hospital. Dr. Alastair Blackwood here. There is a young boy, Leo Vance. I am establishing an anonymous fund to cover all of his medical expenses, present and future. All of them. I want your best specialist to contact his mother today and inform her that a donor has taken care of everything. Anonymity is paramount. An hour later, Ilara was woken by a hesitant knock on her door. She opened it to find her landlord, a perpetually grumpy man named Mr. Henderson, looking utterly bewildered. Morning, Ilara, he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. Look, there's been a change. The building's been sold. The new owner, well, he says your rent is taken care of. Indefinitely, Ilara stared at him, her mind unable to process the words. What? I don't understand. Neither do I, Henderson grumbled. Just said you're a permanent tenant, no charge. The eviction notice was a mistake. He scurried away before she could ask any more questions. She stood in the doorway, clutching the frame for support, a wave of disbelief washing over her. A mistake. It felt like a miracle. Not 10 minutes later, her phone rang, a number she didn't recognize. Is this Mrs. Ilara Vance? A kind, professional voice asked. Yes, she whispered. My name is Dr. Anya Sharma. I'm the head of pediatric pulmonology at City General Hospital. I'm calling about your son, Leo. An anonymous benefactor has just set up a comprehensive care fund in his name. All of his treatments, medications, and hospital visits are covered from now on. We'd like to schedule an appointment for him this afternoon. Ilara sank onto the sofa, the phone slipping from her grasp. Sobs racked her body, but these were not tears of despair. They were tears of overwhelming, cathartic relief. She didn't know who was responsible for this sudden, miraculous turn of events. A secret angel, a twist of fate, she didn't know. All she knew was that her son was going to be okay. Just as she was trying to absorb the morning's impossible events, her phone rang a third time. It was a private number. Is this Ilara? A low, quiet voice asked. A voice she recognized. It was the man from the storm. Yes, she breathed, her heart beginning to pound. This is Alistair Blackwood, he said simply. There was a mistake yesterday. The housekeeper was acting without my authority. She has been dismissed. The position is yours, if you still want it. I would be grateful if you would accept. Elara was speechless. The owner of the mansion, the reclusive billionaire, was the man she had given bread to. The world tilted on its axis. Yes, she finally managed to say. Yes, of course, good, he said, a hint of something that might have been relief in his tone. Please, start tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock, the line went dead. Elara looked over at Leo, who was beginning to stir. A golden glow of morning sunlight, the first she had seen in days, streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of genuine hope. A new chapter was beginning. She had no idea how deeply intertwined her life was about to become with the sad, quiet man who lived in the lonely mansion on the hill. The protective intervention was complete. The next morning, Elara arrived at the gates of Blackwood Manor under a clear, crisp sky. The mansion, bathed in the amber hue of sunrise, looked less like a Gothic tomb and more like a sleeping giant. It was still imposing, but the fear she had felt before was replaced by a nervous curiosity. She was shown in by a new, younger housekeeper who treated her with quiet respect. The inside of the house was even more cavernous and opulent than she had imagined. Polished marble floors stretched out into the distance, reflecting the light from colossal chandeliers. The air was still and cool, carrying the faint scent of lemon polish and old paper. There was a sterile silence to the place, the kind of deep quiet that speaks not of peace, but of profound absence. She was led to the main library to await Mr. Blackwood. The room was magnificent, with floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with leather-bound books. A grand fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. She ran a hand over the polished wood of a nearby table, her reflection looking back at her, a small, out-of-place figure in this world of stately grandeur. She heard a soft footstep behind her and turned. Alistair Blackwood stood in the doorway. He was no longer the disheveled, grief-stricken man from the storm. He was dressed in an impeccable, crisp white shirt and dark trousers. His hair was neatly combed, but his eyes were the same. They were the eyes of a man carrying an unbearable weight, haunted and impossibly sad. Elara, he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Thank you for coming, Mr. Blackwood, she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. For the job, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The house is large, he said, deflecting her gratitude. It requires a great deal of upkeep, an unspoken tension hung in the air between them. They were both aware of their first meeting, of the strange, raw intimacy of that moment in the rain, but neither knew how to address it. He was her employer now, a man of immense power and wealth. And she was his maid. The chasm between their stations felt as wide and deep as an ocean. The first few weeks passed in a strange, silent routine. Elara worked diligently, cleaning the endless succession of vast, empty rooms. She rarely saw Alistair. He remained a ghost in his own home, a fleeting presence she would sometimes glimpse at the end of a long corridor or through a half-open study door. He ate his meals alone. He spoke to no one. The house remained a quiet, sterile sanctuary of sorrow. Elara, however, brought a subtle warmth to the cold spaces. She polished the furniture until it gleamed, but her touch was gentle. She arranged the stiff, formal flower arrangements with a softer, more natural hand. She hummed quietly to herself as she worked, a soft, melodic sound that was the only sign of life in the silent halls. She was a quiet, steady presence, and Alistair, from the shadows of his solitude, began to notice. He would find himself pausing to listen for the soft sound of her humming. He noticed the way the sunlight seemed to catch in her hair as she cleaned the tall windows in the ballroom. He saw the quiet dignity in her posture, the unwavering resolve in her eyes. She moved through his world of cold, hard surfaces like a gentle tide, slowly eroding the sharp edges of his grief. Her presence was a quiet reminder of the goodness he had thought was lost to the world. And Alara, in turn, began to see past the billionaire. She saw the profound loneliness in the man who had everything. She saw the way his shoulders slumped when he thought no one was watching. She saw the raw pain that still flickered in the depths of his storm-gray eyes. They were two wounded souls, orbiting each other in a cavernous, silent universe, each recognizing the other's unspoken pain. One evening, Alara was tasked with dusting the long-neglected west wing of the mansion, a section Alistair had ordered to be kept locked since his family's death. He had, for some unknown reason, asked her to clean it. The rooms were shrouded in white cloths, the furniture like sleeping ghosts under their veils. The air was thick with the dust of years and the heavy scent of memories left to decay. In what must have been a nursery, a room painted a soft, pale yellow, she found a small object on a dusty shelf, overlooked by the passage of time. It was a silver rattle, intricately carved with tiny stars and a crescent moon. It was tarnished with age, but still beautiful. She picked it up, its weight cool and solid in her palm. A soft, gentle chime sounded as she turned it over. It was a sound of innocence, of laughter, of a life that had once filled these silent rooms. A sound of unbearable loss. "What are you doing in here?" His voice, sharp and cracked with emotion, made her jump. Alistair stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the rattle in her hand. His carefully constructed composure had shattered. He looked raw, vulnerable, like the man she had met in the storm. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, quickly placing the rattle back on the shelf. "You asked me to clean this wing." He didn't seem to hear her apology. He walked slowly into the room, his movements stiff, as if wading through a sea of painful memories. He reached out and picked up the silver rattle, his fingers clenching around it. "It was my daughter's," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "Lily." She loved the sound it made. This was the first time he had spoken her name to anyone in 5 years. They stood in the quiet, dimly lit nursery, the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. The moment felt sacred, a fragile truce in the war of their shared grief. Alistair's walls had finally crumbled, and the story of his tragedy poured out of him in a raw, halting monologue. He told her about Isabel, his vibrant, laughing wife, and their daughter, Lily, a little girl with her mother's eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. He spoke of the car crash on a rainy night, the slick roads, the phone call that had splintered his world into a million irreparable pieces. He spoke of the guilt, the suffocating emptiness, the years he had spent as a walking dead man in the mausoleum he called home. Alara listened with unwavering, steady eyes. She didn't offer empty platitudes or hollow words of comfort. She simply stood there and bore witness to his pain, her quiet presence a profound act of empathy. She was giving him a space to finally, truly grieve. When he was done, a heavy silence fell between them, but it was no longer the sterile silence of the mansion. It was a shared, compassionate quiet. Alistair finally looked at her, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "You shouldn't have to hear all this." Alara reached into the collar of her simple dress and pulled out a small, silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it. Inside was the tiny photograph of her David, his kind eyes smiling out at her. "My husband," she said softly, her voice gentle. "He had a laugh that could make you forget all your troubles. He worked too hard, always for us. A fever took him in 3 days. The doctors couldn't do anything." She shared her own tragedy, not to compare their pain, but to connect with it. She spoke of her fear, her loneliness, and the quiet resolve to keep going for her son, Leo. She forged a bond with him, there in the dusty nursery, a bond built not on their stations in life, but on the common, hallowed ground of loss. He looked at the picture in the locket, then at her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as his maid, not as a charity case, but as a fellow traveler in the landscape of sorrow. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on her shoulder. The simple, non-romantic physical contact was electric, a current of shared humanity passing between them. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying a universe of meaning. That night, he found her in the kitchen and made her a cup of tea, his movements clumsy but sincere. They sat in comfortable silence, two lonely souls finding a fragile solace in each other's company. The house was still quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Weeks turned into months. A fragile, unspoken bond grew between Elara and Alastair. The formal titles of Mr. Blackwood and Elara slowly softened into Alastair and Elara during their quiet moments together. He started joining her for tea in the kitchen late at night. He would talk about his business, the pressures of his world, and she would talk about Leo, his improving health, his laughter that was slowly filling their small apartment with joy. Alastair began to change. The haunted look in his eyes was gradually replaced by a quiet warmth. He started smiling, small, tentative smiles at first, but genuine ones. He reopened the West Wing, and Elara helped him pack away Isabel and Lily's things, not as an act of erasure, but as a tender act of remembrance. The house itself seemed to breathe again. However, this thawing of Alastair's frozen heart did not go unnoticed. His mother, Beatrice Blackwood, a woman for whom cruelty was a sport and status was a religion, began to hear whispers of her son's re-emergence. She decided it was time to reclaim her influence and orchestrated a grand charity gala to be held at the mansion, forcing Alastair back into the public eye. The night of the gala, the mansion was transformed. The sterile silence was replaced by the buzz of conversation and the swell of classical music. Gleaming chandeliers cast a golden glow on the city's elite, who moved through the cavernous rooms like peacocks, adorned in silk and jewels. Alastair looked commanding in an impeccable tuxedo, but his eyes were uneasy as he played the part of the gracious host. Elara, at her own insistence, was working the event as part of the catering staff, wanting to help and not feeling like she belonged among the glittering guests. She moved quietly through the crowds, her simple black dress a stark contrast to the couture gowns around her. She felt invisible, and she preferred it that way. She saw Alastair across the ballroom, surrounded by people, his face a polite, distant mask. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that brief glance, a silent conversation passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of this world. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile, a private gesture just for her. But Beatrice saw it. Her eyes, cold and sharp as a hawk's, narrowed. She had noticed the subtle changes in her son, the new light in his eyes, and she had noticed the quiet, dignified maid who always seemed to be nearby. In her twisted, elitist mind, she saw a threat. This lowborn, insignificant woman was stealing her son away, poisoning him with common sentimentality. A venomous jealousy took root in her heart. She decided, in that moment, to crush Elara, to humiliate her so thoroughly that Alastair would be forced to cast her aside. Beatrice waited for her moment. She found it when Alastair was briefly pulled away by the mayor. She approached Elara near a dessert table, her smile a predatory slash of red lipstick. "You there," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. The maid, Elara turned, her expression respectful. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood." Beatrice's smile widened. "My diamond bracelet. It's missing. I believe I was standing right here when I last had it." She glanced down at Elara's apron. "You have been hovering around me all evening. I wonder, did something shiny catch your eye?" Elara's blood ran cold. I wouldn't," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I haven't seen any bracelet." Beatrice's voice rose, attracting the attention of the nearby guests. "Oh, I'm sure you haven't seen it. A desperate little thing like you, with a sick child, I hear. The temptation must be overwhelming." The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. A circle of guests began to form, their faces a mixture of shock and cruel curiosity. "I am not a thief," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm, her dignity her only shield. "Of course not," Beatrice sneered, her voice now a triumphant shout for the whole room to hear. "Then you won't mind if I check your pockets, will you?" Before Elara could react, Beatrice lunged forward and plunged her hand into Elara's apron pocket, pulling out a glittering diamond bracelet. She held it up for everyone to see. "Well, well. What do we have here?" A collective gasp went through the crowd. Elara stared at the bracelet, her face ashen. She was being framed. She was being publicly crucified. Tears welled in her eyes, but she stood tall, her posture dignified even as she was being visibly overwhelmed by the sheer, calculated cruelty of the attack. "You are a worthless, pathetic thief," Beatrice hissed, her face contorted with triumphant malice. "And you will be thrown out of this house and into a jail cell where you belong." "That is enough," the voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. It was calm, but it held a commanding power that made every head turn. Alistair made his dramatic entrance, parting the sea of onlookers as he walked towards his mother. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "What is the meaning of this, mother?" Beatrice faltered for a second, surprised by his sudden appearance. "Alistair, darling. I've just caught this creature stealing my bracelet." "She was preying on your good nature." Alistair didn't even glance at the bracelet. His eyes were fixed on Elara, on the tears shimmering on her lashes and the unwavering dignity in her stance. He then turned his gaze to his mother, and the coldness in his eyes was absolute. He began to speak, his voice resonating through the now silent ballroom in a powerful monologue. "For 5 years, this house has been a tomb. For 5 years, I have been a ghost. You, mother, were content with that. You preferred the grieving recluse to the man who might challenge your authority. You filled my home with your sycophants and your cruelty, and you called it managing my affairs." He took a step closer to her, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And then she came. This woman, who you call a thief." He turned to face the stunned guests. "I want to tell you all how I met Elara. I met her on the darkest day of my life, on the anniversary of my wife and daughter's death. I was standing outside these gates in the pouring rain, a broken man. I looked like a beggar. And this woman," he said, turning back to Elara and gently taking her hand, "this woman, who had nothing, gave me her last piece of food. She gave me her only umbrella. She did it without knowing who I was, without expecting anything in return. She showed me a purity, a selflessness I thought had vanished from the world." He then looked directly at Beatrice, his eyes burning with righteous anger. "And you accuse her of stealing a trinket? You, who have never performed a single selfless act in your entire life." "That bracelet," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "is one I purchased last week. I had it delivered to your room this morning as a gift. You planted it on her." Beatrice's face went white. She was speechless. Alistair squeezed Elara's hand, his touch a warm, protective anchor. He raised his voice once more, addressing the entire room. "Elara Vance is not a thief. She is the most honorable person I have ever known. She is not a member of the staff here tonight. She is my guest." He pulled her gently forward, placing her by his side, completely reversing the power dynamic. "And as for the rest of you," he said, his sweeping gaze dismissing the staff his mother had hired, "you are all dismissed. Your employment is terminated, effective immediately." He then looked at his mother, his expression one of finality. "And you, Beatrice? You are no longer welcome in this house. You will leave now, and you will not return." He had publicly offered Elara his protection and status, and in the same breath, disavowed the woman who had tried to destroy her. The public salvation was complete. Beatrice stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and humiliation, utterly defeated. Without another word, Alistair led Elara away from the gawking crowd, leaving a shattered party and a room full of stunned silence in their wake. He led her to the quiet sanctuary of the library, the same room where they had first truly spoken. He guided her to a soft leather armchair by the now roaring fireplace, the golden glow of the flames dancing on her pale face. He knelt before her, still holding her hand. The adrenaline of the confrontation faded, leaving behind a raw, tender silence. Elara was still trembling, the shock and humiliation of the accusation still coursing through her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, all the fury gone, replaced with a deep, gentle concern. She could only nod, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. He reached up and carefully wiped it away with his thumb, his touch sending a shiver through her. "I'm so sorry, Elara," he whispered. "I'm sorry you had to endure that. I should have protected you from her." "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice shaky. I didn't know people could be so cruel." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a profound emotion she had never seen there before. "And I didn't know people could be so good," he said, "until I met you." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself. "There's something else you need to know, Elara. It wasn't a miracle that saved your apartment. It wasn't a random act of fate that secured Leo's medical care. It was me." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You?" He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "After you helped me in the storm, I had to find you. When I learned of your struggles, I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not after what you did for me." I was the anonymous donor. The full weight of his confession settled over her. This man hadn't just given her a job. He had secretly, silently saved her. He had given her back her home, her hope, her son's future. The pieces all clicked into place, and she was overwhelmed by the depth of his quiet, powerful kindness. "Why?" she whispered, the question full of awe. "Because you saved me first," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You don't understand. I was dead inside, Elara. This house was my tomb, and I was just waiting to fade away. But your kindness, it was like a flashlight in the darkest cellar. It was the first warmth I had felt in 5 years. You showed me that there was still light in the world. You gave me a reason to want to live again, not just exist." He stood up and began to pace in front of the fire, his movements charged with a new, vibrant energy. "I don't want this house to be a tomb anymore," he said, his voice filled with a passion she had never heard. "I want it to be a home. I want to fill these silent halls with laughter. I want to hear the sound of a child running down the corridors." He stopped and turned to face her, his heart in his eyes. "I want to fill it with you, Elara." And with Leo, he walked back to her and took both of her hands in his grip firm and sure. "I am not just offering you a job or my protection. I am offering you my heart. I love you, Elara. I have fallen in love with your strength, your dignity, and your beautiful, selfless soul." His romantic declaration hung in the warm air between them, pure and undeniable. Tears were now streaming freely down Elara's face, but they were tears of profound, cathartic joy. In the face of his raw, honest confession, her own feelings, which she had kept carefully buried, rose to the surface. She loved this sad, gentle man who had seen her at her lowest and had not looked away. She loved the man who had healed her life from the shadows before he had ever truly known her. "Alistair," she breathed, her voice full of wonder. She stood up and stepped into his arms, and he held her tightly, as if he would never let her go. In the quiet warmth of the library, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, 2 broken hearts finally found their way home, becoming whole in each other's embrace. 1 year later. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the Blackwood Manor, no longer a cold, sterile museum but a warm, vibrant home. The heavy, dark drapes had been replaced with light, airy curtains that danced in the gentle breeze. The polished marble floors were now softened by colorful rugs, and the once empty halls echoed with a sound they hadn't heard in years, the gleeful, uninhibited laughter of a child. Leo, now healthy and robust, his cheeks rosy and his eyes bright, chased a small, bouncy ball across the sun-drenched lawn. His cough was a distant memory, replaced by a boundless energy that filled every corner of their new life with joy. Elara stood on the terrace, watching him, a serene smile on her face. She was no longer the pale, threadbare woman from the storm. She was radiant, her face full of a deep, peaceful happiness. A strong pair of arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into Alistair's familiar, comforting embrace. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own eyes, once so haunted, now clear and full of a quiet, profound love as he watched the boy play. "He's getting faster," Alistair chuckled, his voice a warm rumble against her ear. "He is," Elara agreed, her heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it almost hurt. "He's happy, we're all happy," Alistair corrected her gently. He turned her in his arms to face him, his gaze soft and adoring. He had become a different man over the past year. The weight of his grief had finally lifted, not forgotten, but integrated into a life that was once again full of purpose and love. He was a husband again. He was a father again. In Leo's toy box, among wooden blocks and stuffed animals, sat a small, polished silver rattle, its gentle chime now a sound of new beginnings. The mansion was no longer a tomb. It was a home, filled with light, laughter, and an unwavering, hard-won love. This story is a testament to the profound, transformative power of a single, selfless act. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we feel we have nothing left to give, a simple gesture of kindness can be the spark that ignites a miracle, not just for the receiver, but for the giver as well. Elara's quiet dignity and Alistair's hidden pain found solace and redemption in one another, proving that love and compassion are the greatest treasures of all, capable of rebuilding a life from the ashes of despair. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the goodness of people, we hope you'll continue to follow our journey. We are dedicated to bringing you narratives that explore the depths of human connection and the beautiful resilience of the human spirit. These are more than just stories, they are reminders of the light that exists in all of us. For more soul-stirring tales of love, loss, and redemption, please like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to continue creating inspiring content that warms the heart and uplifts the soul. We'll see you in the next one.